Algorithms to Live by the Computer Science of Human Decisions. Author, Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths. 11. Game Theory: The Minds of Others. I'm an optimist in the sense that I believe humans are noble and honorable, and some of them are really smart. I have a somewhat more pessimistic view of people in groups. Steve Jobs. An investor sells a stock to another, one convinced it's headed down, and the other convinced it's going up. I think I know what you think, but have no idea what you think I think. An economic bubble bursts. A prospective lover offers a gift that says neither I want to be more than friends nor I don't want to be more than friends. A table of diners squabbles over who should treat whom and why. Someone trying to be helpful unintentionally offends. Someone trying hard to be cool draws snickers. Someone trying to break from the herd finds, dismayingly, the herd following his lead. I love you, says one lover to another. I love you, too, the other replies, and both wonder what exactly the other means by that. What does computer science have to say about all this? School children are taught to conceive of literary plots as belonging to one of several categories: man versus nature, man versus self, man versus man, man versus society. Thus far in this book we have considered primarily cases in the first two categories, that is to say, computer science has thus far been our guide to problems created by the fundamental structure of the world and by our limited capacities for processing information. Optimal stopping problems spring from the irreversibility and irrevocability of time, the explore/exploit dilemma, from time's limited supply. Relaxation and randomization emerge as vital and necessary strategies for dealing with the ineluctable complexity of challenges like trip planning and vaccinations. In this chapter we shift the focus and consider the remaining two genres, that is, man versus man and man versus society. In effect, the problems that we pose and cause each other. Our best guide to this terrain comes from a branch of mathematics known as game theory, a field that in its classical incarnation had an enormous impact on the 20th century. In the past couple of decades, cross-pollination between game theory and computer science has produced the field of algorithmic game theory, which has already begun to have an impact on the 21st. Recursion. Now, a clever man would put the poison into his own goblet, because he would know that only a great fool would reach for what he was given. I'm not a great fool, so I can clearly not choose the wine in front of you. But you must have known I was not a great fool, you would have counted on it, so I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me. The Princess Bride. Arguably the most influential economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, once said that successful investing is anticipating the anticipations of others. For a share of stock to be sold at, say, $60, the buyer must believe he can sell it later for $70 to someone who believes he can sell it for $80 to someone who believes he can sell it for $90 to someone who believes he can sell it for $100 to someone else. In this way, the value of a stock isn't what people think it's worth, but what people think it's worth. In fact, even that's not going far enough. As Keynes put it, making a crucial distinction between beauty and popularity. Professional investment may be likened to those newspaper competitions in which the competitors have to pick out the 6 prettiest faces from 100 photographs, the prize being awarded to the competitor whose choice most nearly corresponds to the average preferences of the competitors as a whole, so that each competitor has to pick not those faces which he himself finds prettiest, but those which he thinks likeliest to catch the fancy of the other competitors, all of whom are looking at the problem from the same point of view. It is not a case of choosing those which, to the best of one's judgment, are really the prettiest, nor even those which average opinion genuinely thinks the prettiest. We have reached the third degree, where we devote our intelligences to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. And there are some, I believe, who practice the fourth, fifth, and higher degrees. Computer science illustrates the fundamental limitations of this kind of reasoning with what's called the halting problem. As Alan Turing proved in 1936, a computer program can never tell you for sure whether another program might end up calculating forever without end except by simulating the operation of that program, and thus potentially going off the deep end itself. Accordingly, programmers will never have automated tools that can tell them whether their software will freeze. This is one of the foundational results in all of computer science, on which many other proofs hang. Simply put, anytime a system, be it a machine or a mind, simulates the workings of something as complex as itself, it finds its resources totally maximumed out, more or less by definition. Computer scientists have a term for this potentially endless journey into the hall of mirrors: mind simulating minds, recursion. In poker, you never play your hand. James Bond says in Casino Royale, you play the man across from you. In fact, what you really play is a theoretically infinite recursion. There's your own hand and the hand you believe your opponent to have, then the hand you believe your opponent believes you have, and the hand you believe your opponent believes you to believe he has. And on it goes. I don't know if this is an actual game theory term, says the world's top rated poker player, Dan Smith, but poker players call it leveling. Level 1 is I know. 2 is you know that I know. 3, I know that you know that I know. There are situations where it just comes up where you are like, wow, this is a really silly spot to bluff. But if he knows that it is a silly spot to bluff, then he won't call me, and that's where it's a clever spot to bluff. Those things happen. One of the most memorable bluffs in high-level poker occurred when Tom Dwan wagered $479,500 on Texas Hold'em's absolute worst possible hand, the 2-7, while literally telling his opponent, Sammy George, that he was holding it. "You don't have deuce 7. George replied, "You don't have deuce 7. George folded and won with, yes, deuce 7 took the pot. In poker, recursion is a dangerous game. You don't want to get caught one step behind your opponent, of course, but there's also an imperative not to get too far ahead of them either. There's a rule that you really only want to play one level above your opponent, explains poker professional Vanessa Rauso. If you play too far above your opponent, you're going to think they have information that they don't actually have, and they won't be able to glean the information that you want them to glean from your actions. Sometimes poker pros will deliberately bait their opponent into a convoluted recursion, meanwhile playing completely by the book, unpsychological poker themselves. This is known as luring them into a leveling war against themselves. Luring an opponent into fruitless recursion can be an effective strategy in other games too. One of the most colorful, bizarre, and fascinating episodes in the history of man vs machine chess came in a 2008 blitz showdown between American Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura and leading computer chess program Rybka, in a game where each side got just 3 minutes on the clock to play all of their moves or automatically lose. The advantage surely seemed to be on the side of the computer, capable of evaluating millions of positions every second and of making its move without twitching a muscle. But Nakamura immediately gridlocked the board and proceeded to make repetitive meaningless moves as fast as he could click. Meanwhile, the computer wasted precious moments fruitlessly searching for winning variations that didn't exist and doggedly trying to anticipate all the possible future moves by Nakamura, who himself was simply doing the chess equivalent of twiddling his thumbs. When the computer had nearly exhausted its time and began flailing so as not to lose by the clock, Nakamura finally opened the position and crashed through. Given recursion's dangers, how do poker professionals break out of it? They use game theory. Sometimes you can come up with reasons to make exploitive, leveling plays, but a lot of the time you are just making inferior plays for reasons that are really just noise. Dan Smith explains, I try really hard to have a base level of theory understanding in most situations. I always start by knowing or trying to know what Nash is. So what is Nash? Reaching equilibrium. You know the rules, and so do I. We know the game, and we are gonna play it. Rick Astley. Game theory covers an incredibly broad spectrum of scenarios of cooperation and competition, but the field began with those resembling heads-up poker, two-person contests, where one player's gain is another player's loss. Mathematicians analyzing these games seek to identify a so-called equilibrium, that is, a set of strategies that both players can follow such that neither player would want to change their own play, given the play of their opponent. It's called an equilibrium because it's stable. No amount of further reflection by either player will bring them to different choices. I'm content with my strategy, given yours, and you're content with your strategy, given mine. In rock paper scissors, For example, the equilibrium tells us, perhaps unexcitingly, to choose one of the eponymous hand gestures completely at random, each roughly a third of the time. What makes this equilibrium stable is that once both players adopt this 13 strategy, there is nothing better for either to do than stick with it. If we tried playing, say, more rock, our opponent would quickly notice and start playing more paper, which would make us play more scissors, and so forth until we both settled into the 13 equilibrium again. In one of the seminal results in game theory, the mathematician John Nash proved in 1951 that every two-player game has at least one equilibrium. This major discovery would earn Nash the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994 and lead to the book and film A Beautiful Mind about Nash's life. Such an equilibrium is now often spoken of as the Nash Equilibrium, the Nash that Dan Smith always tries to keep track of. On the face of it, the fact that a Nash equilibrium always exists in two-player games would seem to bring us some relief from the Hall of Mirrors recursions that characterize poker and many other familiar contests. When we feel ourselves falling down the recursive rabbit hole, we always have an option to step out of our opponent's head and look for the equilibrium, going directly to the best strategy, assuming rational play. In rock paper scissors, scrutinizing your opponent's face for signs of what they might throw next may not be worthwhile if you know that simply throwing at random is an unbeatable strategy in the long run. More generally, the Nash equilibrium offers a prediction of the stable long-term outcome of any set of rules or incentives. As such, it provides an invaluable tool for both predicting and shaping economic policy, as well as social policy in general. As Nobel laureate economist Roger Myerson puts it, the Nash equilibrium has had a fundamental and pervasive impact in economics and the social sciences which is comparable to that of the discovery of the DNA double helix in the biological sciences. Computer science, however, has complicated this story. Put broadly, the object of study in mathematics is truth. The object of study in computer science is complexity. As we've seen, it's not enough for a problem to have a solution if that problem is intractable. In a game theory context, knowing that an equilibrium exists doesn't actually tell us what it is or how to get there. As Berkeley computer scientist Christos Papadimitriou writes, game theory predicts the agent's equilibrium behavior typically with no regard to the ways in which such a state will be reached or consideration. That would be a computer scientist's foremost concern. Stanford's Tim Roughgarden echoes the sentiment of being unsatisfied with Nash's proof that equilibria always exist. Okay, he says, but we are computer scientists, right? Give us something we can use. Don't just tell me that it's there, tell me how to find it. And so, the original field of game theory begat algorithmic game theory, that is, the study of theoretically ideal strategies for games became the study of how machines and people come up with strategies for games. As it turns out, asking too many questions about Nash equilibria gets you into computational trouble in a hurry. By the end of the 20th century, determining whether a game has more than one equilibrium, or an equilibrium that gives a player a certain payoff, or an equilibrium that involves taking a particular action, had all been proved to be intractable problems. Then, from 2005 to 2008, Papadimitriou and his colleagues proved that simply finding Nash equilibria is intractable as well. Simple games like rock paper scissors may have equilibria visible at a glance, but in games of real-world complexity it's now clear we cannot take for granted that the participants will be able to discover or reach the game's equilibrium. This, in turn, means that the game's designers can't necessarily use the equilibrium to predict how the players will behave. The ramifications of this sobering result are profound. Nash equilibria have held a hallowed place within economic theory as a way to model and predict market behavior, but that place might not be deserved. As Papadimitriou explains, if an equilibrium concept is not efficiently computable, much of its credibility as a prediction of the behavior of rational agents is lost. MIT's Scott Aronson agrees. In my opinion, he says, if the theorem that Nash equilibria exist is considered relevant to debates about, say, free markets versus government intervention, then the theorem that finding those equilibria is intractable should be considered relevant also. The predictive abilities of Nash Equilibria only matter if those equilibria can actually be found by the players. To quote eBay's former director of research, Kamal Jain, if your laptop cannot find it, neither can the market. Dominant strategies, for better or worse. Even when we can reach an equilibrium, just because it's stable doesn't make it good. It may seem paradoxical, but the equilibrium strategy where neither player is willing to change tack is by no means necessarily the strategy that leads to the best outcomes for the players. Nowhere is that better illustrated than in game theory's most famous, provocative, and controversial two-player game, The Prisoner's Dilemma. The Prisoner's Dilemma works as follows. Imagine that you and a co-conspirator have been arrested after robbing a bank and are being held in separate jail cells. Now you must decide whether to cooperate with each other by remaining silent and admitting nothing or to defect from your partnership by ratting out the other to the police. You know that if you both cooperate with each other and keep silent, the state doesn't have enough evidence to convict either one of you, so you'll both walk free, splitting the loot $500,000 each. Let's say, if one of you defects and informs on the other, and the other says nothing, the informer goes free and gets the entire $1 million, while the silent one is convicted as the sole perpetrator of the crime and receives a 10-year sentence. If you both inform on each other, then you'll share the blame and split the sentence, 5 years each. Here's a problem. No matter what your accomplice does, it's always better for you to defect. If your accomplice has ratted you out, ratting them out in turn will give you 5 years of your life back. You'll get the shared sentence, 5 years, rather than serving the whole thing yourself, 10 years. And if your accomplice has stayed quiet, turning them in will net you the full $1 million. You won't have to split it. No matter what, you're always better off defecting than cooperating, regardless of what your accomplice decides. To do otherwise will always make you worse off, no matter what. In fact, this makes defection not merely the equilibrium strategy, but what's known as a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy avoids recursion altogether by being the best response to all of your opponent's possible strategies, so you don't even need to trouble yourself getting inside their head at all. A dominant strategy is a powerful thing. But now we've arrived at the paradox. If everyone does the rational thing and follows the dominant strategy, the story ends with both of you serving 5 years of hard time, which, compared to freedom and a cool $500,000 apiece, is dramatically worse for everyone involved. How could that have happened? This has emerged as one of the major insights of traditional game theory. The equilibrium for a set of players, all acting rationally in their own interest, may not be the outcome that is actually best for those players. Algorithmic game theory, in keeping with the principles of computer science, has taken this insight and quantified it, creating a measure called the Price of Anarchy. The Price of Anarchy measures the gap between cooperation, a centrally designed or coordinated solution, and competition, where each participant is independently trying to maximize the outcome for themselves. In a game like The Prisoner's Dilemma, this price is effectively infinite. Increasing the amount of cash at stake and lengthening the jail sentences can make the gap between possible outcomes arbitrarily wide, even as the dominant strategy stays the same. There's no limit to how painful things can get for the players if they don't coordinate. But in other games, as algorithmic game theorists would discover, the Price of Anarchy is not nearly so bad. For instance, consider traffic. Whether it's individual commuters trying to make their way through the daily bumper to bumper, or routers shuffling TCP packets across the internet, everyone in the system merely wants what's easiest for them personally. Drivers just want to take the fastest route, whatever it is, and routers just want to shuffle along their packets with minimal effort, but in both cases this can result in overcrowding along critical pathways, creating congestion that harms everyone. How much harm, though? Surprisingly, Tim Roughgarden and Cornel Zavitardis proved in 2002 that the selfish routing approach has a price of anarchy that's a mere 4/3. That is, a free-for-all is only 33% worse than perfect top-down coordination. Roughgarden and Tardis's work has deep implications both for urban planning of physical traffic and for network infrastructure. Selfish routing's low price of anarchy may explain, for instance, why the internet works as well as it does without any central authority managing the routing of individual packets. Even if such coordination were possible, it wouldn't add very much. When it comes to traffic of the humankind, the low price of anarchy cuts both ways. The good news is that the lack of centralized coordination is making your commute at most only 33% worse. On the other hand, if you're hoping that networked, self-driving autonomous cars will bring us a future of traffic utopia, it may be disheartening to learn that today's selfish, uncoordinated drivers are already pretty close to optimal. It's true that self-driving cars should reduce the number of road accidents and may be able to drive more closely together, both of which would speed up traffic. But from a congestion standpoint, the fact that anarchy is only 4/3 as congested as perfect coordination means that perfectly coordinated commutes will only be 3/4 as congested as they are now. It's a bit like the famous line by James Branch Cabell, the optimist proclaims that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist fears this is true. Congestion will always be a problem solvable more by planners and by overall demand than by the decisions of individual drivers, human or computer, selfish or cooperative. Quantifying the price of anarchy has given the field a concrete and rigorous way to assess the pros and cons of decentralized systems, which has broad implications across any number of domains where people find themselves involved in game playing, whether they know it or not. A low price of anarchy means the system is, for better or worse, about as good on its own as it would be if it were carefully managed. A high price of anarchy, on the other hand, means that things have the potential to turn out fine if they are carefully coordinated, but that without some form of intervention, we are courting disaster. The prisoner's dilemma is clearly of this latter type. Unfortunately, so are many of the most critical games the world must play. The tragedy of the commons. In 1968, the ecologist Gerrit Hardin took the two-player prisoner's dilemma and imagined scaling it up to involve all the members of a farming village. Hardin invited his readers to picture a commons of public lawn available to be grazed by everyone's livestock, but with finite capacity. In theory, all the villagers should graze only as many animals as would leave some grass for everyone. In practice, though, the benefits of grazing a little bit more than that accrue directly to you, while the harms seem too small to be of consequence. Yet if everyone follows this logic of using just slightly more of the commons than they should, a dreadful equilibrium results. A completely devastated lawn, and no grass for anyone's livestock thereafter. Hardin called this the tragedy of the commons, and it has become one of the primary lenses through which economists, political scientists, and the environmental movement view large-scale ecological crises like pollution and climate change. When I was a kid, there was this thing called leaded gasoline, says Avram Blum, Carnegie Mellon computer scientist and game theorist. Leaded was 10 cents cheaper or something, but it pollutes the environment. Given what everyone else is doing, how much worse really are you personally, health-wise, if you put leaded gasoline in your own car? Not that much worse. It's the prisoner's dilemma. The same is true at the corporate and national levels. A recent newspaper headline put the trouble succinctly: stable climate demands most fossil fuels stay in the ground, but whose? Every corporation, and, to some degree, every nation, is better off being a bit more reckless than their peers for the sake of competitive advantage. Yet if they all act more recklessly, it leads to a ravaged earth, and all for nothing. There's no economic advantage for anyone relative to where they started. The logic of this type of game is so pervasive that we don't even have to look to misdeeds to see it running amok. We can just as easily end up in a terrible equilibrium with a clean conscience. How? Look no further than your company vacation policy. In America, people work some of the longest hours in the world. As The Economist put it, nowhere is the value of work higher and the value of leisure lower. There are few laws mandating that employers provide time off, and even when American employees do get vacation time, they don't use it. A recent study showed that the average worker takes only half of the vacation days granted them, and a stunning 15% take no vacation at all. At the present moment, the Bay Area, where the two of us live, is attempting to remedy this sorry state of affairs by going through a radical paradigm shift when it comes to vacation policy, a shift that is very well-meaning and completely, apocalyptically doomed. The premise sounds innocent enough. Instead of metering out some fixed arbitrary number of days for each employee, then wasting our man hours making sure no one goes over their limit, why not just let your employees free? Why not simply allow them unlimited vacation? Anecdotal reports thus far are mixed, but from a game theoretic perspective, this approach is a nightmare. All employees want, in theory, to take as much vacation as possible. But they also all want to take just slightly less vacation than each other, to be perceived as more loyal, more committed, and more dedicated, hence more promotion worthy. Everyone looks to the others for a baseline, and will take just slightly less than that. The Nash Equilibrium of this game is zero. As the CEO of software company Travis C.I. Matthias Meir writes, people will hesitate to take a vacation as they don't want to seem like that person who's taking the most vacation days. It's a race to the bottom. This is the tragedy of the commons in full effect, and it's just as bad between firms as within them. Imagine two shopkeepers in a small town. Each of them can choose either to stay open 7 days a week or to be open only 6 days a week, taking Sunday off to relax with their friends and family. If both of them take a day off, they'll retain their existing market share and experience less stress. However, if one shopkeeper decides to open his shop 7 days a week, he'll draw extra customers, taking them away from his competitor and threatening his livelihood. The Nash Equilibrium, again, is for everyone to work all the time. This exact issue became a flashpoint in the United States during the 2014 holiday season, as retailer after retailer, unwilling to cede market share to competitors who were getting ahead of the usual post-Thanksgiving shopping rush, caved in toward the lousy equilibrium. Stores are opening earlier than ever before, the International Business Times reported. Masses decided to open 2 hours earlier than the year before, as did Target. Kmart, for its part, opened at 6 AM on Thanksgiving morning, and was continuously open for 42 hours. So what can we, as players, do when we find ourselves in such a situation? Either the two-party prisoner's dilemma, or the multi-party tragedy of the commons. In a sense, nothing. The very stability that these bad equilibria have, the thing that makes them equilibria, becomes damnable. By and large, we cannot shift the dominant strategies from within. But this doesn't mean that bad equilibria can't be fixed. It just means that the solution is going to have to come from somewhere else. Mechanism design. Change the game. Don't hate the player, hate the game. Ice-T. Don't ever take sides with anyone against the family again ever. The Godfather. The prisoner's dilemma has been the focal point for generations of debate and controversy about the nature of human cooperation. But University College London game theorist Ken Binmore sees at least some of that controversy as misguided. As he argues, it's just plain wrong that the prisoner's dilemma captures what matters about human cooperation. On the contrary, it represents a situation in which the dice are as loaded against the emergence of cooperation as they could possibly be. Well, if the rules of the game force a bad strategy, maybe we shouldn't try to change strategies. Maybe we should try to change the game. This brings us to a branch of game theory known as mechanism design. While game theory asks what behavior will emerge given a set of rules, mechanism design, sometimes called reverse game theory, works in the other direction, asking what rules will give us the behavior we want to see. And if game theory's revelations, like the fact that an equilibrium strategy might be rational for each player yet bad for everyone, have proven counterintuitive, the revelations of mechanism design are even more so. Let's return you and your bank-robbing co-conspirator to the jail cell for another go at the prisoner's dilemma, with one crucial addition: the Godfather. Now you and your fellow thief are members of a crime syndicate, and the Don has made it, shall we say, all too clear that any informants will sleep with the fishes. This alteration of the game's payoffs has the effect of limiting the actions you can take, yet ironically makes it far more likely that things will end well, both for you and your partner. Since defection is now less attractive, to put it mildly, both prisoners are induced to cooperate, and both will confidently walk away $500,000 richer. Minus, of course, a nominal tithe to the Don. The counterintuitive and powerful thing here is we can worsen every outcome, death on the one hand, taxes on the other, yet make everyone's lives better by shifting the equilibrium. For the small town shopkeepers, a verbal truce to take Sundays off would be unstable. As soon as either shopkeeper needed some extra cash, he'd be liable to violate it, prompting the other to start working Sundays as well so as not to lose market share. This would land them right back in the bad equilibrium, where they get the worst of both worlds. They are exhausted and don't get any competitive advantage for it. But they might be able to act as their own don by signing a legally binding contract to the effect that, say, any proceeds earned by either shop on a Sunday go to the other shop. By worsening the unsatisfactory equilibrium, they'd make a new and better one. On the other hand, a change to the game's payoffs that doesn't change the equilibrium will typically have a much smaller effect than desired. The CEO of the software firm Evernote, Phil Libin, made headlines with a policy of offering Evernote employees $1,000 cash for taking a vacation. This sounds like a reasonable approach to getting more employees to take vacation, but from a game theoretic perspective it's actually misguided. Increasing the cash on the table in the prisoner's dilemma, for instance, misses the point. The change doesn't do anything to alter the bad equilibrium. If $1 million heist ends up with both thieves in jail, so does a $10 million heist. The problem isn't that vacations aren't attractive. The problem is that everyone wants to take slightly less vacation than their peers, producing a game whose only equilibrium is no vacation at all, or $1,000 sweetens the deal, but doesn't change the principle of the game, which is to take as much vacation as possible, while still being perceived as slightly more loyal than the next guy or gal, therefore getting a raise or promotion over them that's worth many thousands of dollars. Does this mean that Libin needs to offer tens of thousands of dollars per employee per vacation? No. Mechanism design tells us that Libin can get the happy employees he wants with the stick, rather than the carrot. He can get a better equilibrium without spending a dime. For instance, he could simply make a certain minimal amount of vacation compulsory. If he can't change the race, he can still change the bottom. Mechanism design makes a powerful argument for the need for a designer, be it a CEO, a contract binding all parties, or a don who enforces omitted by garroted carotid. A league commissioner is this kind of a designer as well. Imagine how pathetic a sight the NBA would be if there were no games as such, and teams could simply score on each other at literally any time between the start and end of the season. 3 AM on a Sunday, noon on Christmas, you name it. What you'd see would be haggard, cadaverous players in extreme sleep debt, forcing vigilance with chemical stimulants, almost losing their minds. War is like this. On the other hand, even Wall Street ruthless cutthroat capitalists trading by the microsecond in the city that never sleeps, comes to a ceasefire every day at 4 PM sharp, so that brokers can sleep at predictable hours every night without getting too badly ambushed by competitors pushing toward a sleepless equilibrium. In this sense, the stock market is more a sport than a war. Scaling up this logic results in a potent argument for the role of government. In fact, many governments do have laws on the books mandating minimum vacations and limiting shop hours. And while the United States is one of the only developed nations without federal requirements for paid vacation, Massachusetts, Maine, and Rhode Island do have state-level prohibitions on Thanksgiving commerce. Laws like these often stem from the colonial era and were initially religious in nature. Indeed, religion itself provides a very direct way of modifying the structure of games of this kind. In particular, a religious law such as Remember the Sabbath Day neatly solves the problem faced by the shopkeepers, whether enforced by an all-powerful god or by the more proximate members of a religious community, and adding divine force to injunctions against other kinds of antisocial behavior, such as murder, adultery, and theft, is likewise a way to solve some of the game theoretic problems of living in a social group. God happens to be even better than government in this respect, since omniscience and omnipotence provide a particularly strong guarantee that taking bad actions will have dire consequences. It turns out there's no Godfather quite like God the Father. Religion seems like the kind of thing a computer scientist rarely talks about. In fact, it's literally the subject of a book called Things a Computer Scientist Rarely Talks About. But by reducing the number of options that people have, behavioral constraints of the kind imposed by religion don't just make certain kinds of decisions less computationally challenging, they can also yield better outcomes. Mechanism designed by evolution. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Adam Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of. Blaise Pascal. The redwoods of California are some of the oldest and most majestic living things on the planet. From a game theoretic standpoint, though, they're something of a tragedy. The only reason they're so tall is that they're trying to be taller than each other up to the point where the harms of overextension are finally even worse than the harms of getting shaded out. As Richard Dawkins puts it, the canopy can be thought of as an aerial meadow, just like a rolling grassland prairie, but raised on stilts. The canopy is gathering solar energy at much the same rate as a grassland prairie would, but a substantial portion of the energy is wasted by being fed straight into the stilts, which do nothing more useful than loft the meadow high in the air, where it picks up exactly the same harvest of photons as it would at far lower cost if it were laid flat on the ground. If the forest could only somehow agree to a kind of truce, the ecosystem could enjoy the photosynthetic bounty without the wood-making arms race wasting it all. But as we've seen, good outcomes in these scenarios tend only to arise in the context of an authority outside the game, someone changing the payoffs from the top down. It would seem as though in nature, then, there is simply no way of establishing good equilibria between individuals. On the other hand, if cooperation really does lead to better outcomes in certain games, then we'd expect that cooperatively minded species would prevail evolutionarily. But then where would the cooperation come from if it's only rational at the group level, not the individual level? Maybe it would have to come from something that individuals can't entirely control. Something, for instance, like emotions. Consider two seemingly unrelated scenarios. 1. A man buys a vacuum cleaner. It breaks within a few weeks, and he spends 10 minutes online leaving a vindictive review. 2. A woman shopping at a convenience store notices someone steal an elderly man's wallet and bolt for the door. She tackles the thief and wrestles the wallet free. Though the latter protagonist seems clearly heroic, and the former merely angry, what these vignettes have in common, albeit in very different ways, is involuntary selflessness. The unhappy consumer isn't trying to get the vacuum cleaner replaced or his money back. He's after a highly indirect kind of retribution, from which in a rational, game theoretic sense he stands to gain little other than the spiteful satisfaction of writing the review itself. In the convenience store, the heroic woman metes out vigilante justice at enormous personal cost. She risks injury or even death to return, say, $40 to a man who is a total stranger to her. Even if she wanted to help, she could have simply taken $20 out of her own pocket and given them to him without risking a trip to the In this sense, both protagonists are acting irrationally. On the other hand, their actions are good for their society. We all want to live in a world in which pickpocketing doesn't pay and in which businesses that sell poor quality products get a bad reputation. Perhaps each of us, individually, would be better off being the kind of person who can always make a detached, calculated decision in their own best interest, not willing to lose time fuming over a sunk cost, let alone lose a tooth over $40. But all of us are better off living in a society in which such defiant stands are common. So what has acted up in these people, in the absence of an external authority, to make them buck the selfish equilibrium? Anger, for one thing. Whether prompted by a shoddy business or a petty thief, outrage can override rationality, and in these instances, it may be that the hand of evolution has done what it would otherwise have taken an authority outside the game to accomplish. Nature is full of examples of individuals being essentially hijacked to serve the goals of another species. The lancet liver fluke, Dicrocolium dendriticum, for instance, is a parasite that makes ants deliberately climb to the tops of grass blades so that they'll be eaten by sheep, the lancet fluke's preferred host. Likewise, the parasite Toxoplasma gondii makes mice permanently lose their fear of cats, with similar results. Emotion, for the bitter, retaliatory consumer and for the convenience store hero alike, is our own species taking over the controls for a minute. Morality is herd instinct in the individual, wrote Nietzsche. Paraphrasing slightly, we might hazard that emotion is mechanism design in the species. Precisely because feelings are involuntary, they enable contracts that need no outside enforcement. Revenge almost never works out in favor of the one who seeks it, and yet someone who will respond with irrational vehemence to being taken advantage of is for that very reason more likely to get a fair deal. As Cornell economist Robert Frank puts it, if people expect us to respond irrationally to the theft of our property, we will seldom need to, because it will not be in their interests to steal it. Being predisposed to respond irrationally serves much better here than being guided only by material self-interest, lest you think that civilized modern humans have legal contracts and rule of law instead of retribution. Recall that it's often more work and suffering to sue or prosecute someone than the victim could ever hope to recover in material terms. Lawsuits are the means for self-destructive retaliation in a developed society, not the substitute. As for anger, so for compassion and guilt and love. As odd as it might sound, the prisoner's dilemma also has a lot to tell us about marriage. In our discussion of optimal stopping problems, such as the secretary problem, back in chapter 1, we looked at both dating and apartment hunting as cases where we must make a commitment with possible future options yet unseen. In both love and housing, though, we continue to encounter more options even after our optimal stopping decision is made, so why not be ready to jump ship? Of course, knowing that the other party, be it spousal landlord, is in turn prepared to jump ship would prevent many of the long-term investments, having children together, or laboriously moving in one's belongings, that make those agreements worthwhile. In both cases this so-called commitment problem can be at least partially addressed by a contract. But game theory suggests that in the case of dating, the voluntary bonds of the law are less relevant to an enduring partnership than the involuntary bonds of love itself. As Robert Frank puts it, the worry that people will leave relationships because it may later become rational for them to do so is largely erased if it is not rational assessment that binds them in the first place. He explains. Yes, people search for objective characteristics they care about. Everybody wants somebody who's kind and intelligent and interesting and healthy and maybe physically attractive, good earning power, the whole laundry list of features, but that's the first pass. After you've spent enough time together, it's not those things that make you want to stay together. It's just the fact that it's that particular person that is what's valuable to you. So you don't really need the contract so much as you need a feeling that makes you not want to separate, even though objectively there might be a better option available to you. Said differently, love is like organized crime. It changes the structure of the marriage game so that the equilibrium becomes the outcome that works best for everybody. Playwright George Bernard Shaw once wrote of marriage that, if the prisoner is happy, well, lock him in. If he is not, why pretend that he is? Game theory offers a subtle answer to this particular riddle. Happiness is the lock. A game theoretic argument for love would highlight one further point. Marriage is a prisoner's dilemma in which you get to choose the person with whom you're in cahoots. This might seem like a small change, but it potentially has a big effect on the structure of the game you're playing. If you knew that, for some reason, your partner in crime would be miserable, if you weren't around the kind of misery even $1 million couldn't cure, then you'd worry much less about them defecting and leaving you to rot in jail. So the rational argument for love is twofold. The emotions of attachment not only spare you from recursively overthinking your partner's intentions, but by changing the payoffs actually enable a better outcome altogether. What's more, being able to fall involuntarily in love makes you, in turn, a more attractive partner to have. Your capacity for heartbreak, for sleeping with the emotional fishes, is the very quality that makes you such a trusty accomplice. Information cascades, the tragic rationality of bubbles. Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect. Mark Twain. Part of the reason why it's a good idea to pay attention to the behavior of others is that in doing so, you get to add their information about the world to your own. A popular restaurant is probably good, a half-empty concert hall is probably a bad sign, and if someone you're talking to abruptly yanks their gaze towards something you can't see, it's probably not a bad idea to turn your head to. On the other hand, learning from others doesn't always seem particularly rational. Fads and fashions are the result of following others' behavior without being anchored to any underlying objective truth about the world. What's worse, the assumption that other people's actions are a useful guide can lead to the sort of herd following that precipitates economic disaster. If everybody else is investing in real estate, it seems like a good idea to buy a house. After all, the price is only going to go up, isn't it? An interesting aspect of the 2007 to 2009 mortgage crisis is that everybody involved seemed to feel like they were unfairly punished for simply doing what they were supposed to. A generation of Americans who grew up believing that houses were fail-safe investments and who saw everyone around them buying houses despite, or because of, rapidly rising prices, were badly burned when those prices finally started to tumble. Bankers, meanwhile, felt they were unfairly blamed for doing what they had always done, offering opportunities, which their clients could accept or decline. In the wake of an abrupt market collapse, the temptation is always to assign blame. Here game theory offers a sobering perspective. Catastrophes like this can happen even when no one's at fault. Properly appreciating the mechanics of financial bubbles begins with understanding auctions. While auctions may seem like niche corners of the economy evoking either $1,000,000 oil paintings at Sotheby's and Christie's, or Beanie Babies and other collectibles on eBay, they actually power a substantial portion of the economy. Google, for instance, makes more than 90% of its revenue from selling ads, and those ads are all sold via auctions. Meanwhile, governments use auctions to sell rights to bands of the telecommunications spectrum, such as cell phone transmission frequencies, raising tens of billions of dollars in revenue. In fact, many global markets, in everything from homes to books to tulips, operate via auctions of various styles. One of the simplest auction formats has each participant write down their bid in secret, and the one whose bid is highest wins the item for whatever price they wrote down. This is known as a sealed bid first price auction, and from an algorithmic game theory perspective there's a big problem with it actually, several. For one thing, there's a sense in which the winner always overpays. If you value an item at $25, and I value it at $10, and we both bid our true valuations, $25 and $10, then you end up buying it for $25 when you could have had it for just a hair over $10. This problem, in turn, leads to another one, which is that, in order to bid properly, that is, in order not to overpay, you need to predict the true valuation of the other players in the auction and shade your bid accordingly. That's bad enough, but the other players aren't going to bid their true valuations either, because they are shading their bids based on their prediction of yours. We are back in the land of recursion. Another classic auction format, the Dutch auction or descending auction, gradually lowers an item's price until someone is willing to buy it. The name references the Aalsmeer flower auction, the largest flower auction in the world, which takes place daily in the Netherlands, but Dutch auctions are more prevalent than they might initially seem. A store marking down its unsold items, and landlords listing apartments at the highest price they think the market will bear. Both share its basic quality. The seller is likely to begin optimistically and nudge the price down until a buyer is found. The descending auction resembles the first price auction in that you're more likely to win by paying near the top of your range. That is, you'll be poised to bid as the price falls to $25 and therefore will want a shadier offer by some complexly strategic amount. Do you buy at $25 or stay your hand and try to wait for a lower price? Every dollar you save risks losing out altogether. The inverse of a Dutch or descending auction is what's known as an English auction or ascending auction, the most familiar auction format. In an English auction, bidders alternate raising the price until all but one of them drop out. This seems to offer something closer to what we want. Here, if you value an item at $25 and I value it at $10, you'll win it for just over $10 without either having to go all the way to $25 or disappearing down the strategic rabbit hole. Both the Dutch auction and English auction introduce an extra level of complexity when compared to a sealed bid auction. However, they involve not only the private information that each bidder has, but also the public flow of bidding behavior. In a Dutch auction, it is the absence of a bid that reveals information by making it clear that none of the other bidders value the item at the current price level. And under the right circumstances, this mixing of private and public data can prove toxic. Imagine the bidders are doubtful about their own estimations of the value of an auction lot, say, the right to drill for oil in some part of the ocean. As University College London game theorist Ken Moore notes, the amount of oil in a tract is the same for everybody, but the buyer's estimates of how much oil is likely to be in a tract will depend on their differing geological surveys. Such surveys aren't only expensive, but notoriously unreliable. In such a situation, it seems natural to look closely at your opponent's bids to augment your own meager private information with the public information. But this public information might not be nearly as informative as it seems. You don't actually get to know the other bidders' beliefs, only their actions. And it is entirely possible that their behavior is based on your own. just as your behavior is being influenced by this. It's easy to imagine a bunch of people all going over a cliff together because everyone else was acting as though it'd all be fine, when in reality each person had qualms but suppressed them because of the apparent confidence of everyone else in the group. Just as with the tragedy of the commons, this failure is not necessarily the player's fault. An enormously influential paper by the economists Sushil Bikhchandani, David Hirschleifer, and Ivo Welsh has demonstrated that under the right circumstances, a group of agents who are all behaving perfectly rationally and perfectly appropriately can nonetheless fall prey to what is effectively infinite misinformation. This has come to be known as an information cascade. To continue the oil drilling rights scenario, imagine there are 10 companies that might bid on the rights for a given tract. One of them has a geological survey suggesting the tract is rich with oil, another survey is inconclusive, the reconnaissance of the other 8 suggests it's barren. But being competitors, of course, the companies do not share their survey results with each other and instead can only watch each other's actions. When the auction begins, the first company, with the promising report, makes a high initial bid. The second company, encouraged by this bid to take an optimistic view of their own ambiguous survey, bids even higher. The third company has a weak survey, but now doesn't trust it in light of what they take to be 2 independent surveys that suggest it's a gold mine, so they make a new high bid. The fourth company, which also has lackluster survey, is now even more strongly inclined to disregard it, as it seems like 3 of their competitors all think it's a winner, so they bid too. The consensus unglues from reality. A cascade has formed. No single bidder has acted irrationally, yet the net result is catastrophe. As Hirschleifer puts it, something very important happens once somebody decides to follow blindly his predecessors independently of his own information signal, and that is, that his action becomes uninformative to all later decision makers. Now the public pool of information is no longer growing. That welfare benefit of having public information has ceased. To see what happens in the real world when an information cascade takes over, and the bidders have almost nothing but one another's behavior to estimate an item's value, look no further than Peter A. Lawrence's developmental biology text The Making of a Fly, which in April 2011 was selling for $23,698,655.93 plus $3.99 shipping on Amazon's third-party marketplace. How and why had this admittedly respected book reached a sale price of more than $23 million? It turns out that 2 of the sellers were setting their prices algorithmically as constant fractions of each other. One was always setting it to 0.99830 times the competitor's price, while the competitor was automatically setting their own price to 1.27059 times the others. Neither seller apparently thought to set any limit on the resulting numbers, and eventually the process spiraled totally out of control. It's possible that a similar mechanism was in play during the enigmatic and controversial stock market flash crash of May 6, 2010, when, in a matter of minutes, the price of several seemingly random companies in the S&P 500 rose to more than $100,000 a share, while others dropped precipitously, sometimes to $0 and 1 cent a share. Almost $1 trillion of value instantaneously went up in smoke, as CNBC's Jim Cramer reported live, dumbfounded, that it can't be there. That is not a real price. Oh well, just go buy Procter. Just go buy Procter & Gamble. They reported a decent quarter, just go buy it. I mean, this is a good opportunity. Cramer's incredulity is his private information holding up against the public information. He's seemingly the only person in the world willing to pay, in this case, $49 for a stock that the market is apparently valuing at under $40, but he doesn't care. He's seen the quarterly reports. He's certain in what he knows. Investors are said to fall into 2 broad camps: fundamental investors, who trade on what they perceive as the underlying value of a company, and technical investors, who trade on the fluctuations of the market. The rise of high-speed algorithmic trading has upset the balance between these 2 strategies, and it's frequently complained that computers, unanchored to the real-world value of goods, unbothered at pricing a textbook at tens of millions of dollars and blue-chip stocks at a penny, worsen the irrationality of the market. But while this critique is typically leveled at computers, people do the same kind of thing too, as any number of investment bubbles can testify. Again, the fault is often not with the players, but with the game itself. Information cascades offer a rational theory not only of bubbles, but also of fads and herd behavior more generally. They offer an account of how it's easily possible for any market to spike and collapse, even in the absence of irrationality, malevolence, or malfeasance. The takeaways are several. For one, be wary of cases where public information seems to exceed private information, where you know more about what people are doing than why they are doing it, where you're more concerned with your judgments fitting the consensus than fitting the facts. When you're mostly looking to others to set a course, they may well be looking right back at you to do the same. Second, remember that actions are not beliefs. Cascades get caused, in part, when we misinterpret what others think, based on what they do. We should be especially hesitant to overrule our own doubts, and if we do, we might want to find some way to broadcast those doubts even as we move forward, lest others fail to distinguish the reluctance in our minds from the implied enthusiasm in our actions. Last, we should remember from the prisoner's dilemma that sometimes a game can have irredeemably lousy rules. There may be nothing we can do once we're in it, but the theory of information cascades may help us to avoid such a game in the first place. And if you're the kind of person who always does what you think is right, no matter how crazy others think it is, take heart. The bad news is that you will be wrong more often than the herd followers. The good news is that sticking to your convictions creates a positive externality, letting people make accurate inferences from your behavior. There may come a time when you will save the entire herd from disaster. To thine own self compute. The application of computer science to game theory has revealed that being obligated to strategize is itself a part, often a big part, of the price we pay in competing with one another. And as the difficulties of recursion demonstrate, nowhere is that price as high as when we are required to get inside each other's heads. Here, algorithmic game theory gives us a way to rethink mechanism design, to take into account not only the outcome of the games, but also the computational effort required of the players. We've seen how seemingly innocuous auction mechanisms, for instance, can run into all sorts of problems: overthinking, overpaying, runaway cascades. But the situation is not completely hopeless. In fact, there's one auction design in particular that cuts through the burden of mental recursion like a hot knife through butter. It's called the Vickery Auction. Named for Nobel Prize winning economist William Vickery, the Vickery Auction, just like the first price auction, is a sealed bid auction process. That is, every participant simply writes down a single number in secret, and the highest bidder wins. However, in a Vickery auction, the winner ends up paying not the amount of their own bid, but that of the second place bidder. That is to say, if you bid $25 and I bid $10, you win the item at my price. You only have to pay $10. To a game theorist, a Vickery auction has a number of attractive properties. And to an algorithmic game theorist in particular, one property especially stands out: the participants are incentivized to be honest. In fact, there is no better strategy than just bidding your true value for the item, exactly what you think the item is worth. Bidding any more than your true value is obviously silly, as you might end up stuck buying something for more than you think it's worth. And bidding any less than your true value, that is, shading your bid, risks losing the auction for no good reason, since it doesn't save you any money, because if you win, you'll only be paying the value of the second highest bid, regardless of how high your own was. This makes the Vickery auction what mechanism designers call strategy proof, or just truthful. In the Vickery auction, honesty is literally the best policy. Even better, honesty remains the best policy regardless of whether the other bidders are honest themselves. In the prisoner's dilemma, we saw how defection turned out to be the dominant strategy, the best move, no matter whether your partner defected or cooperated. In a Vickery auction, on the other hand, honesty is the dominant strategy. This is the mechanism designer's holy grail. You do not need to strategize or recurse. Now, it seems like the Vickery auction would cost the seller some money compared to the first price auction, but this isn't necessarily true. In a first price auction, every bidder is shading their bid down to avoid overpaying. In the second price Vickery auction, there's no need to, in a sense. The auction itself is optimally shading their bid for them. In fact, a game theoretic principle called revenue equivalence establishes that over time, the average expected sale price in a first price auction will converge to precisely the same as in a Vickery auction. Thus the Vickery Equilibrium involves the same bidder winning the item for the same price without any strategizing by any of the bidders whatsoever. As Tim Roughgarden tells his Stanford students, the Vickery auction is awesome. For Hebrew University algorithmic game theorist Noam Nissen, this awesomeness has an air to it that's nearly utopian. You would like to get some kind of rules of society where it's not worthwhile to lie, and then people won't lie so much, right? That's the basic idea. From my point of view, the amazing thing about Vickery is that you wouldn't expect that in general it's possible to do that, right? Especially in things like an auction, where of course I want to pay less. How can you ever get? And then yet Vickery shows, here is a way to do that. I think that's really fantastic. In fact, the lesson here goes far beyond auctions. In a landmark finding called the Revelation Principle, Nobel laureate Roger Myerson proved that any game that requires strategically masking the truth can be transformed into a game that requires nothing but simple honesty. Paul Milgram, Myerson's colleague at the time, reflects, it's one of those results that as you look at it from different sides, on the one side, it's just absolutely shocking and amazing, and on the other side, it's trivial. And that's totally wonderful. It's so awesome. That's how you know you're looking at one of the best things you can see. The revelation principle may seem hard to accept on its face, but its proof is actually quite intuitive. Imagine that you have an agent or a lawyer who will be playing the game for you. If you trust them to represent your interests, you're going to simply tell them exactly what you want, and let them handle all of the strategic bid shading and the recursive strategizing on your behalf. In the Vickery auction, the game itself performs this function. And the revelation principle just expands this idea. Any game that can be played for you by agents to whom you'll tell the truth, it says, will become an honesty is best game if the behavior you want from your agent is incorporated into the rules of the game itself. As Nissen puts it, the basic thing is, if you don't want your clients to optimize against you, you'd better optimize for them. That's the whole proof. If I design an algorithm that already optimizes for you, there is nothing you can do. Algorithmic game theory has made huge contributions to a number of practical applications over the past 20 years, helping us understand packet routing on the internet, improving FCC spectrum auctions that allocate precious, if invisible, public goods, and enhancing the matching algorithms that pair medical students with hospitals, among others. And this is likely just the beginning of much larger transformation. We are just scratching the surface, says Nissen. Even in the theory we are just starting to understand it. And there is another generation probably until what I completely understand today theoretically will successfully be applied to humans. It's a generation. I think not more than that. It will take a generation. French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote that hell is other people. He didn't mean that others are inherently malicious or unpleasant, but rather that they complicate our own thoughts and beliefs. When we think about ourselves, when we try to know ourselves, we use the knowledge of us which other people already have. We judge ourselves with the means other people have given us for judging ourselves. Into whatever I say about myself, someone else's judgment always enters. Into whatever I feel within myself, someone else's judgment enters. But that does not at all mean that one cannot have relations with other people. It simply brings out the capital importance of all other people for each one of us. Perhaps, given what we've seen in this chapter, we might endeavor to revise Sartre's statement. Interacting with others doesn't have to be a nightmare, although in the wrong game it surely can be. As Keynes observed, popularity is complicated, intractable, a recursive hall of mirrors, but beauty, in the eye of the beholder, is not. Adopting a strategy that doesn't require anticipating, predicting, reading into, or changing course because of the tactics of others is one way to cut the Gordian knot of recursion. And sometimes that strategy is not just easy, it's optimal. If changing strategies doesn't help, you can try to change the game. And if that's not possible, you can at least exercise some control about which games you choose to play. The road to hell is paved with intractable recursions, bad equilibria, and information cascades. Seek out games where honesty is the dominant strategy. Then just be yourself. Conclusion: computational kindness. I firmly believe that the important things about humans are social in character, and that relief by machines from many of our present demanding intellectual functions will finally give the human race time and incentive to learn how to live well together. Merrill Flood. Any dynamic system subject to the constraints of space and time is up against a core set of fundamental and unavoidable problems. These problems are computational in nature, which makes computers not only our tools, but also our comrades. From this come 3 simple pieces of wisdom. First, there are cases where computer scientists and mathematicians have identified good algorithmic approaches that can simply be transferred over to human problems. The 37% rule, the least recently used criterion for handling overflowing caches, and the upper confidence bound as a guide to exploration, are all examples of this. Second, knowing that you are using an optimal algorithm should be a relief, even if you don't get the results you were looking for. The 37% rule fails 63% of the time. Maintaining your cache with LRU doesn't guarantee that you will always find what you're looking for. In fact, neither would clairvoyance. Using the upper confidence bound approach to the explore/exploit trade-off doesn't mean that you will have no regrets, just that those regrets will accumulate ever more slowly as you go through life. Even the best strategy sometimes yields bad results, which is why computer scientists take care to distinguish between process and outcome. If you followed the best possible process, then you've done all you can, and you shouldn't blame yourself if things didn't go your way. Outcomes make news headlines indeed. They make the world we live in, so it's easy to become fixated on them. But processes are what we have control over. As Bertrand Russell put it, it would seem we must take account of probability in judging of objective rightness. The objectively right act is the one which will probably be most fortunate. I shall define this as the wisest act. We can hope to be fortunate, but we should strive to be wise. Call it a kind of computational stoicism. Finally, we can draw a clear line between problems that admit straightforward solutions and problems that don't. If you wind up stuck in an intractable scenario, remember that heuristics, approximations, and strategic use of randomness can help you find workable solutions. A theme that came up again and again in our interviews with computer scientists was, sometimes good enough really is good enough. What's more, being aware of complexity can help us pick our problems. If we have control over which situations we confront, we should choose the ones that are tractable. But we don't only pick the problems that we pose to ourselves. We also pick the problems we pose each other, whether it's the way we design a city or the way we ask a question. This creates a surprising bridge from computer science to ethics in the form of a principle that we call computational kindness. There's a certain paradox the two of us observed when it came to scheduling the interviews that went into this book. Our interviewees were on average more likely to be available when we requested a meeting, say, next Tuesday between 1 o'clock and 2 p.m. PST than at a convenient time this coming week. At first this seems absurd, like the celebrated studies where people on average donate more money to save the life of one penguin than 8,000 penguins, or a port being more worried about dying in an act of terrorism than about dying from any cause, terrorism included. In the case of interviews, it seems that people preferred receiving a constrained problem, even if the constraints were plucked out of thin air, than a wide open one. It was seemingly less difficult for them to accommodate our preferences and constraints than to compute a better option, based on their own. Computer scientists would not knowingly here, citing the complexity gap between verification and search, which is about as wide as the gap between knowing a good song, when you hear it, and writing one on the spot. One of the implicit principles of computer science, as odd as it may sound, is that computation is bad. The underlying directive of any good algorithm is to minimize the labor of thought. When we interact with other people, we present them with computational problems, not just explicit requests and demands, but implicit challenges such as interpreting our intentions, our beliefs, and our preferences. It stands to reason, therefore, that a computational understanding of such problems casts light on the nature of human interaction. We can be computationally kind to others by framing issues in terms that make the underlying computational problem easier. This matters because many problems, especially social ones, as we've seen, are intrinsically and inextricably hard. Consider this all too common scenario. A group of friends are standing around, trying to figure out where to go for dinner. Each of them clearly has some preferences, albeit potentially weak ones. But none of them wants to state those preferences explicitly, so they politely navigate the social hazards with guesses and half hints instead. They may well come to a resolution that is satisfying to all, but this procedure can easily go awry. The summer after college. For instance, Brian and two friends took a trip to Spain. They negotiated the trip itinerary on the fly, and at one point it became clear that they wouldn't have time to go to the bullfight they'd researched and planned. Only then, as each of the three attempted to console the others, did they suddenly discover that in fact none of them had wanted to see the bullfight in the first place. Each had just gamely adopted what they'd perceived to be the other's level of enthusiasm, thereby producing the level of enthusiasm that the others gamely adopted in turn. Likewise, seemingly innocuous language like "oh, I'm flexible" or "what do you want to do tonight" has a dark computational underbelly that should make you think twice. It has the veneer of kindness about it, but it does two deeply alarming things. First, it passes the cognitive buck, "here's a problem, you handle it." Second, by not stating your preferences, it invites the others to simulate or imagine them. And as we have seen, the simulation of the minds of others is one of the biggest computational challenges a mind, or machine, can ever face. In such situations, computational kindness and conventional etiquette diverge. Politely withholding your preferences puts the computational problem of inferring them on the rest of the group. In contrast, politely asserting your preferences, "personally, I'm inclined toward X, what do you think?" helps shoulder the cognitive load of moving the group toward resolution. Alternatively, you can try to reduce, rather than maximize, the number of options that you give other people, say, offering a choice between 2 or 3 restaurants rather than 10. If each person in the group eliminates their least preferred option, that makes the task easier for everyone. And if you're inviting somebody out to lunch, or scheduling a meeting, offering 1 or 2 concrete proposals that they can accept or decline is a good starting point. None of these actions is necessarily polite, but all of them can significantly lower the computational cost of interaction. Computational kindness isn't just a principle of behavior, it's also a design principle. In 2003, University of Waterloo computer scientist Jeffrey Shallett investigated the question of what coin, if put into circulation in the United States, would most help to minimize the number of coins needed on average to make change. Delightfully, the answer turned out to be an 18-cent piece, but Shallett was somewhat stayed from making a policy recommendation by computational concerns. At present, change making is dead simple. For any given amount, just use as many quarters as you can without going over, then as many dimes as possible, and so on down the denominations. For instance, 54 cents is 2 quarters, then 4 pennies. With an 18-cent piece, that simple algorithm is no longer optimal. 54 cents is then best made with 3 18-cent pieces and no quarters at all. In fact, Shallett observed that ungainly denominations turn change making into something at least as hard as the traveling salesman problem. That's a lot to ask of a cashier. If ease of computation is taken into account, Shallett found, then what the US money supply could best make use of is either a 2-cent or a 3-cent piece. Not quite as exciting as an 18-cent coin, but almost as good, and computationally kinda by a long shot. The deeper point is that subtle changes in design can radically shift the kind of cognitive problem posed to human users. Architects and urban planners, for instance, have choices about how they construct our environment, which means they have choices about how they will structure the computational problems we have to solve. Consider a large parking lot with an array of different lanes, of the kind often found at stadiums and shopping centers. You may drive in one lane toward the destination, see a spot, decide to let it go in favor of, hopefully, a better one farther ahead, but then, finding no such luck, reach the destination and head away down a neighboring lane. After a certain amount of driving, you must decide whether another space is good enough to take, or so far away that you'll try searching in a third lane instead. An algorithmic perspective here is useful not just for the driver, but also for the architect. Contrast the hairy, messy decision problem posed by one of those lots to a single linear path going away from one's destination. In that case, one simply takes the first available space. No game theory, no analysis, no look then leap rule needed. Some parking garages are structured this way, with a single helix winding upward from the ground level. Their computational load is 0. One simply drives forward until the first space appears, then takes it. Whatever the other possible factors for and against this kind of construction, we can definitely say that it's cognitively humane to its drivers, computationally kind. One of the chief goals of design ought to be protecting people from unnecessary tension, friction, and mental labor. This is not just an abstract concern. When mall parking becomes a source of stress, for instance, shoppers may spend less money and return less frequently. Urban planners and architects routinely weigh how different lot designs will use resources such as limited space, materials, and money. But they rarely account for the way their designs tax the computational resources of the people who use them. Recognizing the algorithmic underpinnings of our daily lives in this case, optimal stopping would not only allow drivers to make the best decisions when they are in a particular scenario, but also encourage planners to be more thoughtful about the problems they are forcing drivers into in the first place. There are a number of other cases where computationally kinder designs suggest themselves. For example, consider restaurant seating policies. Some restaurants have an open seating policy, where waiting customers simply hover until a table opens up, and the first to sit down gets the table. Others will take your name, let you have a drink at the bar, and notify you when a table is ready. These approaches to the management of scarce shared resources mirror the distinction in computer science between spinning and blocking. When a processing thread requests a resource and can't get it, the computer can either allow that thread to spin to continue checking for the resource in a perpetual "is it ready yet" loop, or it can block, hold that thread, work on something else, and then come back around whenever the resource becomes free. To a computer scientist, this is a practical trade-off, weighing the time lost to spinning against the time lost in context switching. But at a restaurant, not all of the resources being traded off are their own. A policy of spinning fills empty tables faster, but the CPUs being worn out in the meantime are the minds of their customers, trapped in a tedious but consuming vigilance. As a parallel example, consider the computational problem posed by a bus stop. If there is a live display saying that the next bus is arriving in 10 minutes, then you get to decide once whether to wait, rather than taking the bus's continued not coming as a stream of inferential evidence, moment by moment, and having to ready side and ready side. Moreover, you can take your attention away from squinting down the road spinning for those 10 minutes straight. For cities that aren't up to the implementation necessary to predict the next arrival, we saw how Bayesian inference can even make knowing when the last bus left a useful proxy. Such subtle acts of computational kindness could do as much for readership, if not more, as subsidizing the fares. Think of it as a cognitive subsidy. If we can be kinder to others, we can also be kinder to ourselves. Not just computationally kinder, all the algorithms and ideas we have discussed will help with that, but also more forgiving. The intuitive standard for rational decision making is carefully considering all available options and taking the best one. At first glance, computers look like the paragons of this approach, grinding their way through complex computations for as long as it takes to get perfect answers. But as we've seen, that is an outdated picture of what computers do. It's a luxury afforded by an easy problem. In the hard cases, the best algorithms are all about doing what makes the most sense in the least amount of time, which by no means involves giving careful consideration to every factor and pursuing every computation to the end. Life is just too complicated for that. In almost every domain we've considered, we have seen how the more real-world factors we include, whether it's having incomplete information when interviewing job applicants, dealing with a changing world when trying to resolve the explore/exploit dilemma, or having certain tasks depend on others, when we are trying to get things done, the more likely we are to end up in a situation where finding the perfect solution takes unreasonably long. And indeed, people are almost always confronting what computer science regards as the hard cases. Up against such hard cases, effective algorithms make assumptions, show a bias towards simpler solutions, trade off the costs of error against the costs of delay, and take chances. These aren't the concessions we make when we can't be rational. They're what being rational means. If you enjoyed this video, and want to hear it again, be sure to click the subscribe button and also click the notification bell to switch between getting all notifications, and like and share. Leave your comment and suggestions below. Thank you for watching.